Okay, I'm going to be talking to you about iframes. So this will be the less than useful talk of the day about some of the abuse we've served upon iframes, hence the cat. So, right, just to give you a bit of a background, I've played with iframes for various different things, and real kind of like my utility of iframes have been for detecting global variables back in 2007. JSBin is kind of my side project, come main project now, back in 2008. I use it for like a JavaScript console, jsconsoles, and responsive PX. And there's things I've learned about iframes over those years that basically I've abused them. And most problems I find that after time with iteration can either be solved with an iframe or a set timeout. Pretty much everything can be solved with those two things. I'm not exaggerating. So this was my first kind of real foray with iframes. End of 2008, like September 2008, you'd type some code, you'd hit kind of output, and it would just generate an iframe on the fly. So there was no kind of server hop. It would actually just take your content and render it live. Pretty used to seeing this kind of thing in things like CodePen, Dablet, and so on. 2010, as you were coding, it would render the iframe in real time, which showed I discovered new issues with iframes at that point. And now we've got, we're up to 4 iframes in the third version of JSBin. So at the maximum point in time, there can be 4 iframes going on inside of JSBin. For good reason as well. I don't just add them whenever I can. But like I said, I've got lots of experience with messing with iframes, so I wanted to share that with you today. So this is this kind of beautiful image of the web, or certainly web browsers over the since around 1994, kind of onwards. And just kind of going back in time a little bit, before the precursor to iframes, we had frame sets in 1996 with Netscape 2. So quite a while ago. And what's amazing about frame sets is they were solving a problem that we solve today. They had slow connections back in 96. We have slow connections with 3G and Edge and whatever. And they would have this big web page, a header, a sidebar, and some content. And they basically said, we want to update this little block of content. And we don't want to have to go and request the whole page every single time. So they came up with frame sets, which is very, very similar to what we're solving with Ajax. And they even work today. So if you don't want to do, if Ajax scares you, you can put a frame set in your beautiful, expensive iPhone 5 and use frame sets. So, I'm sure you'll all rush out to do that tomorrow. If you ever written a bookmarklet and have written something like document.head append child, it's because your document may not have a body. That was the risk. And in this example behind me, you can see that there's no body in the element, but actually document.body is a shortcut to the body of the document, and there's an instance where the body can actually just be a frame set. So this stuff all still works. This legacy stuff still works. But I wouldn't recommend frame sets for the time being. They've been properly deprecated now. So iframes came along in '97 via Microsoft. So Microsoft just invented them, as they did with inner HTML and XHR. So we don't have to hate them so much. There's lots of cool stuff they've done. The iframe, the I part of iframe is designed for inline. Wikipedia entry suggests it might be this guy, Scott Isaacs. I actually spoke to someone at Microsoft, and they said, we don't name stuff after ourselves. And Netscape had I layers, and the rest is history. We basically have iframes to solve a bunch of problems. Except there was a point in history where XHTML 1.1 drops support for iframes. So JSBin wouldn't be doing the things it's doing with iframes if this had gone through. And Microsoft and IE, being the awesome browser that it is, ignored that recommendation and said, we're not going to implement the object tag. We're going to stick with the iframe. So thank you, IE, for just ignoring the spec there. Now, it's part of HTML5, which is great. So this is a way of dynamically creating an iframe. This is actually the first real-time streaming content coming into browsers. So that it was coined in 2006 by Alex Russell, who works for Google now. And there's the earliest that I could find on the internet that refers to this technique is about 2000. And the idea is, because HTML is progressively rendered, so you can send it a p tag, leave the connection open, and then send another p tag like 5 minutes later, it'll render each p tag one after the other. So it will just render progressively. And the idea is you create an iframe, you point it to an endpoint, and that endpoint serves up script tags. And as the whole script tag gets injected into the page. It then runs up here, just a piece of JavaScript. So the server might be saying, here's a new price, or here's the latest news, or it's pretty cool. I mean, 2000, that's 13 years ago. Someone was doing this, basically doing what we do with WebSockets or event source. And then to inject into that, you have to actually insert it into the DOM in the first place, and then you get a window object for that DOM, for that iframe, and then you can start writing to that. So you would just do create an iframe, give me the iframes window back, and then do window.document, open, write some HTML, and basically that's what JSBin is, that whole thing, with a lot more code around it. And you want to close it off afterwards, because it's like, if you don't close it, basically the load event won't fire. It will render everything, but if you don't close that iframe, that document.write, it's like leaving an open connection to the server. And there's some weird things with iframes. If you create an iframe, drop it into the DOM, inject a whole bunch of content, if you take that iframe out and then put it back in again, it'll be completely reset. So if you're doing any kind of third-party widget stuff, that's a lesson to learn. It'll basically just blow away everything. Maybe that's a pro. Maybe you're just trying to do a reset. And dynamic iframes aren't the same as windows. They don't quite behave like the main window object. A weird example is if you serve up CSS with the wrong MIME type, the browser isn't supposed to render it. But if you serve up an iframe, if you serve CSS to the iframe with the wrong MIME type, it will render it. So there's these weird little quirks. There's something to watch out for. It's the same as the WebKit view on mobile, but not being quite the same as Safari, for instance. So this is the section of my talk where basically, I mean, I've given away the punchline of every single slide, but pretty much all of these solutions are, if you stick it in an iframe, it'll be fine. So, hands up who actually remembers back the BG sound element? Anyone new? Hands up who remembers it. Hands up who used it. Oh, a couple of people, good work. So, obviously, we're missing background sound on mobile, right? Mobile prevents kind of autoplay. You can't get videos to autoplay, but you could do background sound by taking MP3 and sticking it in an iframe. And that will just start playing that music in the background. But sadly, iOS fixed that feature bug. And it was iOS 4, which seems like a long while ago now, since it's kind of we're iOS 7. But we could play background audio, which was cool for a brief moment when I was trying to build a game. And then they released iOS 5, and that killed that. OK, so what about websites that don't have JSON APIs? Maybe there's a website like, GitHub have their gist embeds, or Lanyard. If you use that, they don't have an API per se, but you can actually just inject content into your website. So if you come across a website that gives you like an embeddable script, and you want to use it as an API, well, you can stick it in an iframe. You basically put that script, you basically create a dynamic iframe, and in that dynamic iframe, once it's actually in the document, you just write out the script tag to the embeddable. You wait for the window to load, because it will trigger a load event, and then you just scrape all that DOM out, and you can expose that as an API. Obviously, read their terms and conditions. You're probably stealing their content some way or another, but it does work really well. Detecting globals, like I said, this is something I did a while back, and I think it's been revised in about 2009 to make it a bit better. Really simple though. If you've worked with anyone else, there's a point where you just leak a global, and you probably want to clean it up. So a nice little quick way of checking that is you take an iframe and you take the main window element and you compare the difference. And there's some extra objects on the iframe, but you look for where you've leaked out the I variable, for instance. So that works really well. There was a weird thing which Brian LaRue of PhoneGap explained to me, or told me about, and it kind of it explained why I was seeing a particular problem. So, okay, so to tell you what I was seeing, JSBin works on mobile, and as you type, it's doing an XHR save. So everything you're typing, it's doing a request, and it's saving as you're going along. And in Chrome for iOS, I was typing, and then the keyboard would just vanish. I just thought, okay, that's just a new browser. But it turns out PhoneGap had the same problem. You're in PhoneGap, if you start typing and you do an XHR request, the keyboard will go away. And Brian was telling me that they fixed it by sticking the XHR request in an iframe. That solves the keyboard vanishing. Works really well. I'm not sure if they've even fixed it in the latest version of iOS, but it's certainly in iOS 6. And the solution is just stick the XHR request inside of an iframe, and the keyboard remains where it's supposed to be. So it applies to anything that's a mobile web view, so PhoneGap, Chrome for iOS, any kind of embedded web views, and so on. Hopefully you've all heard of clickjacking. That was a fun time. You can use it to poop in people. That would be fun. Obviously, you can use it to maybe promote other projects. But this has actually been this has been serious enough that technology has kind of moved on and stopped us from clickjacking browsers like IE9 and above. So maybe if you want to clickjack an IE8 user, you still got a fairly good chance there. But you can send an extra header into in the request that says don't allow this window to be basically iframes. This is the reason why Google or Twitter, if you put that in an iframe, nothing loads, it just throws an exception because they send this header up. There's another trick which I learned with responsive PX, which was basically a tool for working out breakpoints. I stick the web page in an iframe, move a slider, find out kind of where the breakpoints in, where the layout breaks. But I found that by putting the web page into an iframe, the entire web page in an iframe, it completely ignores the meta viewport tag. So if you've ever browsed a web page where you know they've just kind of used CSS to hide some of the functionality, if you just stick that entire page in an iframe, you'll just get it back. You get the whole thing back. It just ignores the meta viewport. Now, for instance, CodePen use iframes to render their full output, and JSPin doesn't. It just gives you exactly what it doesn't frame off the content you coded, which is why on JSPin, if you have a meta tag, it kind of renders correctly, basically. Anyone remember this? Dropdowns, Flash showing through back before, whilst Flash was still used for ads, I guess. Iframes are the solution there. Basically, if any, for some reason, Flash had some higher priority in the DOM, not a Z-index, but it was just another embedded document, so it would actually sit above everything. And you'd have your navigation, then your massive Flash ad, and they would hover over the navigation, and your element would kind of appear, and your Flash ad would just sit on top of it no matter what. So the solution there, and I think there was a jQuery plugin for this, is to put an iframe behind the select box, or put an iframe behind that DOM node, and it will just stop the Flash ad from appearing through it. And I think there's something like BG iframe jQuery plugin, which does that for you. It just sticks lots of iframes on your page. Speaking of ads, I've certainly had to kind of try and deal with this, where an ad is using document.write. Quite often, the JavaScript you get from ad companies probably aren't as progressive as you folk. And because of the document.writes, it causes a bunch of blocking, or it can blow away your entire DOM if they mess it up. And one solution I think the New York Times used recently, and maybe Google Plus as well, they create an iframe and they run the ad inside the iframe, and once the iframe is done, they'll take the ad out of the iframe and put it into their DOM. And it loads a little bit quicker because it's happening in this kind of asynchronous iframe magic thing. And basically it boils down to just stick it in an iframe and the problem will go away. Probably my favorite one, if you do need to do a factory reset of a Samsung S3, you just give them an iframe. And the applause is for the engineers that let that one through. So this doesn't work anymore, by the way. They patched this after they saw it go viral across the web. Pretty simple. You just point the iframe to the telephone protocol, give it the code to do a factory reset. It wouldn't prompt the poor user. It wouldn't say, we're about to do a factory reset, or do you want to dial this number? It would just wipe the phone. So yeah, pretty cool. And obviously, testing that was a pain, I guess. Anyway, so iframes are really good for cross-origin communications. There's some actual real uses beyond blowing away mobile phones. So bidirectional, non-socket communication. I mentioned Comet. I use this kind of technique for jsconsoles. So jsconsoles is like a little script inside of a mobile view, and I get a desktop console to that. And we obviously have native tools, like DevTools are really good for this kind of thing now. And sock.js, I think, uses a similar technique as its final fallback. To do this kind of injection, I basically take your mobile site, you add a script. That script generates an iframe to jsconsole.com, which creates a connection to jsconsole that has a stream of messages coming up into the iframe, which are communicated into your mobile page using post message and on message. So that's a fairly common way of communicating between iframes, and a way of saying, yes, I will allow this origin to communicate to this iframe. And then the two-way communication is via an XHR request that coming from the iframe down to the server. And you have techniques like setting a base origin on the document.domain. So if you have twitter.com, it wants to be able to communicate to api.twitter.com inside of an iframe, and they just set document.domain equals twitter.com. Now they're all friends, and they can all communicate nicely, I guess, actually. Alex Sexton has a pretty good slide deck, which I've linked to, talking about basically doing cross-domain communication. One of the techniques is iframes, obviously. But in this instance, where you have an iframe pointing to a.com, and no matter how deeply nested the second iframe to a.com is, it can always communicate to a.com as long as it knows where it is. So that very bottom iframe can refer to the very top window using window.top, and it can call any of the methods that are on that very top frame because it's on the same origin. And this is how the Comet stuff back in between 2000 and 2006 actually worked. This is one of my favorite weird pieces of useful but weird pieces of iframes. You can do you can basically give an iframe a piece of content cross-domain just before it's finished loading, and then you're not allowed to talk. It's like throwing something through a wormhole and then it closes. So you create an iframe, you put it in the DOM, and it's on a different origin, and you say iframe.contentWindow.name equals, and then some JSON or some piece of text. And once the load event is fired on the iframe, you can't talk to it again. But the iframe you just created can now look at window.name, and it can get the content out. It's weird. I don't understand why it works, but it does work. It's some kind of like edge case in the cross-origin rules. But Dojo were using this back in 2008 for doing cross-origin transport of content. We use it in JSBin to support post message, or to get around a post message in IE7, for instance. So we basically tell it ahead of time what the URL looks like. So yeah, 5 years ago, this weird hack was being used. And sandboxing is probably one of the last real uses. Earliest version of sandboxing, 2006, with Dean Edwards. Basically, the idea is you don't know if you can trust the array.indexOf method, or you don't know if you can trust an undefined value is really undefined. So you create an iframe, and you just pluck out that value from a completely clean sandbox. So it's kind of a clean object is returned. You know that is definitely the array in the state that it's supposed to be. And there's a couple of places where it's being used in big production websites. So using iframes with the appcache, because the appcache is a little bit janky and not rendering, but janky as in dodgy. So the technique is any request to the root application gets the normal website, so the .js website, and any requests to the non-root, so .js/schedule, has an iframe inside of it, which has an app cache that points to the document that has an app cache on it, and that adds a fallback saying /star, so anything that's not the root falls back to the root. Now, every single request outside of the root document has a fallback, which means that it will work offline basically. And the FT Labs Economist mobile app, Lanyard, I know definitely do this. I think there was another big website that used this kind of technique, using an iframe with an app cache. There is lots of really cool future stuff, actual useful stuff, rather than wiping phones, that you can use iframes for, like post message on message. There's a seamless attribute which gives you a seamless iframe. It's not, the spec isn't quite great at this point. Source doc, where you can basically take an attribute in the HTML and put a lot of HTML in that attribute, and a bunch of sandboxing properties where it stops like JavaScript being run from inside of that iframe. So lots of actual useful stuff. There's a link at the bottom of a really good talk from a guy from Discuss. I'm out of time. Maybe I'll talk about set timeout next time. I'm hiring. I had to put that in the back. But otherwise, I'm done. Thank you for listening.